As we did yesterday, and we'll continue to do each day in this retreat, this session after lunch will be focusing on the compassion wing of practice. We said that if we only really engage in Shamatha and Vipashyana practice, that can be a little bit unbalanced. Particularly if we engage in just Shamatha practice and we start to get some experience, we start to have a little bit more calm mind and peaceful experience, then what can often happen is we simply use that Shamatha practice as a way of withdrawing from the world into this little bubble of peace that I'm creating here. And that's not a very healthy state, this state of withdrawal. So these practices we're doing are not about withdrawing from the world, it's about being able to engage in the world in a better way. So to avoid that, we have the compassion wing of practice, which is all about staying connected with the world. And also what we saw yesterday and we'll see today is that both loving kindness and compassion give us direction for our practice as well, in terms of genuine happiness, in terms of overcoming suffering. So not only do they help us to stay connected, they really give our practice a very healthy direction. And so yesterday we looked at loving kindness. Today we'll look at compassion. Compassion is translation of the Sanskrit and Pali term karuna, which is defined as simply the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So what we see here, as with loving kindness, is that compassion here is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's a wish. It's an aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. The emotion that precedes compassion, of course, is empathy. And it's important to have empathy. Otherwise, it's difficult for compassion to arise. And I want to speak a little bit more about this relationship between empathy and compassion tomorrow, because we often hear about compassion burnout, when actually it's impossible to have compassion burnout, it's actually empathy burnout. But I want to talk about that tomorrow. So of course, if we want to cultivate compassion for ourselves and others, then we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how do we eliminate those causes. Because if we don't know those three things, compassion is just words with no meaning. So let's have a look at those three things. What is compassion? What is suffering? What are the causes of suffering? How do we eliminate those causes? Because compassion, of course, is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So we need to know those three things if we want to cultivate compassion. So what is suffering? Here the word suffering is a translation of the Sanskrit term dukkha. Normally when we see the word suffering, we associate that with simply unpleasant, painful physical and mental experiences. But here, this term dukkha has a much more broad meaning than that. In fact, this word dukkha here is describing the human condition. And to really appreciate what this word dukkha means, we can look at what's called three types or three levels of dukkha. So the first type or level of dukkha is the dukkha of suffering. And here the word suffering is talking about our unpleasant, painful physical and mental experiences. So of course this is certainly something we want to be free of. And then, of course, also part of the human condition is that sometimes we have pleasant experiences. This is called the dukkha of change. To highlight that our pleasant experiences change, meaning they're temporary, transient. That these pleasant experiences are never going to last, fulfill us and satisfy us. And thereby understanding this to avoid the craving and attachment towards pleasant experiences, which of course causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. But there's something deeper going on here than just merely pleasant and unpleasant experiences. And that is what's called all-pervasive dukkha. All-pervasive dukkha means that the human condition is such that there's always a potential for suffering to arise. No matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, there's always a possibility for suffering to arise in any moment. Our life is pervaded by that potential. So that is the deepest meaning here of this word suffering or dukkha. So when we are cultivating compassion for ourselves and others, then at the deepest level we have an aspiration to be free of this, to be free of the potential for suffering to arise in our life. Even though maybe in the current moment there is no physical or mental actual suffering going on. So this word dukkha, actually one etymology is the prefix du is short for the root dis, meaning sort of bad. And ka can mean space. So dukkha meaning bad space, as in something not quite right. And what's not quite right is that at the deepest level, the human condition is such that there's always a potential for suffering to arise. Why is that there? Why is there always a potential for suffering to arise in our life? It's because our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. So as long as we have mental afflictions in our mind, then suffering can arise in any moment. And we saw there yesterday briefly that in Buddhist psychology, when we give an extensive presentation of mental afflictions, we have a list of 26, the so-called 6 root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary mental afflictions. But all of those can be condensed down into the 3 main mental afflictions called the 3 poisons. The first of those is ignorance. In Sanskrit that is avidya. Vidya means to know, is negation, not knowing. So ignorance here, ignorance in general, is simply a mind that's confused about something. But here, in ignorance, this ignorance in the 3 poisons is an ignorance, is a specific ignorance. It's an ignorance that's confused about how things exist. So it's not simply not knowing reality, but it's an active misunderstanding of how things exist. And so, of course, this is one of the main topics we're going to look at in the second half of this retreat when we look at the Vipashyana practice. And then the other 2 mental afflictions, which we briefly mentioned yesterday, first, of course, is attachment, in Sanskrit, raga. So we had a look at attachment yesterday. And the third one is aversion, in Sanskrit, dvesha. Sometimes here, instead of aversion in 3 poisons, we'll see anger listed. And that's because anger is a very strong type of aversion, very destructive, very harmful. And so we're going to, a little bit later in the session, we're going to look at anger, what it is, and how to deal with it. So what we're saying here then is, in terms of cultivating compassion, the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. We're not simply talking about the wish to be free of unpleasant experiences. At the deepest level, we're talking about the wish to be free of this, all-pervasive dukkha, the potential for suffering to arise in our life. And what are its causes? Why are we stuck in that state? Is because of the mental afflictions. As long as these mental afflictions are contaminating our mind, then suffering can arise in any moment. And of course, at the deepest level here, it's the ignorance which is the root cause of mental afflictions and suffering. And that's that's something, that process we're going to look at in some detail in the second half of the retreat, but just briefly now, how is it that our distorted view of reality leads to mental afflictions and leads to suffering? And here, this distorted view of reality at the deepest level is this grasping onto an independent me and an independent objective world out there. And so if we have that false grasping, there is an independent me and independent objective world, then, for example, whenever we experience anything, we always have this mental factor of feeling present. And feeling in Buddhism doesn't mean emotion. It's simply experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So let's say when we're looking at these flowers, we're having a pleasant experience. That pleasant experience, together with the seeing those flowers as existing independent of us, will naturally lead us to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant experience. So we'll see these flowers as attractive from their own side, inherently attractive. Or if we're having an unpleasant experience when we see these flowers, together with the belief that those flowers exist independent of us, that will naturally lead us to assume there must be some unattractive quality there that's causing my unpleasant experience. So we'll see them as inherently unattractive or unattractive from their own side. And as we're going to see in the second half of the retreat, this is a misconception. And then mental afflictions easily arise as a basis of that. Because if I'm having a pleasant experience when I see those flowers, it seems like those flowers are the cause of my pleasant experience. And I like pleasant experiences, I want pleasant experiences. So those flowers seem to be causing my pleasant experience, I want those flowers. So that's attachment. Or if we're having an unpleasant experience when we see those flowers, it seems like those flowers are the cause of my unpleasant experience. I don't like unpleasant experiences, I don't want them. Those flowers seem to be causing my unpleasant experience, get them out of here, aversion. So we end up with this, because of this distorted view of reality, we end up with attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. And in all other mental afflictions like craving, jealousy, fear, anxiety, and so forth, come out of one of those or a combination of them. And then that's what's driving our behaviour, and that's what's leading to suffering. And we'll look at that process in more detail in the second half of the retreat. So if we can understand that we are stuck in this state of dukkha or suffering because of our mental afflictions, in particular because of our distorted view of reality. And therefore also we can understand that we can eliminate this distorted view of reality by coming to an insight into the nature of reality. And if we can come to an insight into the nature of reality through Vipashyana practice, we can overcome ignorance, therefore overcome all mental afflictions and overcome suffering and achieve liberation. So if we know those three things, then what is suffering? What are the causes of suffering? How do we eliminate those causes? Then compassion has some meaning. And then, of course, when we cultivate that compassion for ourselves and others, when we cultivate that compassion for ourselves, that aspiration to be free of suffering and its causes would lead us to engaging in practices to overcome the causes of suffering, i.e. Shamatha and Vipashyana practices. And that would also lead us to help others to do likewise. Any questions so far?
I have to confess, I say every day, they all say everything is big. There's something else. I don't know the difference.
You don't know
The difference.
between?
Wish myself and others to be happy or to be free of suffering. In both wishes, I want, in the first place, to get out of samsara, hopefully to eternal enlightenment. In everlasting happiness, same thing.
So the question,
I don't know the difference.
so the question is, what's the difference between loving kindness and compassion? They are two different aspects of the same thing. Because that state of genuine happiness is also the state of freedom from suffering. So we're viewing the same thing, i.e. our well-being, from two perspectives. From the perspective of freedom from suffering and from the perspective of genuine happiness. So again, they're two perspectives of the same thing. But often we cultivate them individually because at our level we need to focus on those two aspects individually. Similarly with wisdom. This wisdom of emptiness. Because we also cultivate individually compassion and wisdom. But actually, they're also two aspects of the same thing, aren't they? Because compassion, if we have freedom from suffering, how do we achieve that? Is through wisdom. And so if we practice the wisdom of Vipashyana, then as a result of that, you'll find that compassion emerges from that. But at our level, we need to work on them individually. But you will find that one is the expression of the other. Because now, to cultivate the wisdom, well, you might say, well, why do I need to do compassion? I'll just do wisdom and then the compassion will come. Technically that may be true, but in reality it's not going to happen. Because to practice wisdom effectively, we need compassion as a companion now. Otherwise, mental afflictions will get in the way, and also our wisdom practice may have an unhealthy direction. So we need to practice them individually, even though they are really two aspects of the same thing. So similarly with loving kindness and compassion. To focus on those two aspects, the happiness and the freedom from suffering. Individually now. But I mean, of course, we end up in the same goal for both of those.
When I practice loving kindness and compassion, like a lot of times it happens to me that I start to, a lot of times, often, that I feel like this expansion and I start tears come up.
Very good.
And I don't know what's it happens a lot, and
good.
I don't know if it's good or kind of an obstacle.
Yeah. So getting very emotional in compassion practice. Of course, I mean, in general, I think it's a very healthy sign. I mean, of course, we could be getting caught up in a lot of stuff and then just... No, it's obviously not what you're talking about. But what's happening, I think, is that we are, if we're really practicing these Well, at the sort of the more surface level, is just a connection with others and seeing the sufferings of others, and so that can be very emotional. But I think also at a deeper level, when we are doing these practices, particularly if we have a little bit of the Vipashyana practice, we are tapping into a much deeper reality. And it sort of feels like sort of coming home. And we have a sense of joy, but it can be also with tears of joy. Because we can see there's hope. We can eliminate this suffering. And we can find that genuine happiness. And so, yeah, I think this can be a very good sign.
Isn't it reasonable to add to this practice just doing for others?
So, isn't it reasonable just doing for others? In fact, this is a measure of whether we are actually doing this practice or we're just mouthing the words. I mean, it's very easy, and we see this in the, I think we got some in the back here. Do we have? No, not in this one. But often when we do practice, there's some prayers we say at the beginning of the meditation. With this, it's like, may all beings have happiness in its causes. May all beings be free of suffering in its causes. And of course, it's very easy to mouth those words. And we say, yes, I'm cultivating loving kindness and compassion. But if in daily life we're not actually helping people when we have an opportunity, we're just words. We're mouthing words. So if we're really understanding what loving kindness and compassion is, that should translate in putting effort for ourselves to overcome the cause of suffering and putting effort to help others. If we're not doing that, I suggest we're just sort of mouthing the words and not really doing anything. You know, because we can even, you know, sometimes have this idea that, oh yes, I'm practicing compassion while we're sitting by and not helping anyone. But I'm practicing compassion. I mean, then I think we're deceiving ourselves. So yeah, that's a way of checking, are we being authentic in our practice, or are we just mouthing some words sort of without really thinking about them? And also in this verse, it says, may all beings be free of suffering and its causes. And it's easy to say those words, they roll off the tongue very easy. But in practical terms, what does that really mean in daily life? In practical terms, it means whoever we come into contact with, may they be happy, may they be free of suffering. So we can mouth those words easily, and at the same time, that horrible person at work, I hope they suffer. No? Then what happened to the compassion, you know, for all sentient beings? Except that person, because they're a horrible person. Okay. Stages of practice. So, like loving kindness, we cultivate compassion in stages, and in the text, the same 4 stages are mentioned. First friend, then strangers, comfortable there, moving out to the so-called difficult people, so-called enemy, and then towards all living beings. But again, I think in the modern world, we need to add one more step at the beginning, and that is how to cultivate compassion for ourselves first. Because very often in the modern world, we're not very kind and compassionate for ourselves. In fact, we often suffer a lot.